2 days before Elvis Presley died, something happened aboard the Lisa Marie, something so unsettling that his personal pilot refused to speak of it for decades. It wasn't a dramatic outburst, nor a medical emergency, but a moment so quietly disturbing that even lifelong Elvis historians completely missed its significance. This final flight confession exposes a side of Elvis the world has never truly seen, a moment that only makes sense when you understand what happened after the wheels touched down. And once you hear it, you'll never look at the King's last days the same way again. Captain Ron Strauss wasn't just another name in Elvis Presley's orbit. He was the man trusted to fly the King across the country during the final years of his life. A seasoned aviator with thousands of hours in the cockpit, Strauss was hired not because he cared about celebrity, but because he was the best at what he did, keeping his passengers safe, his plane steady, and his mouth shut. Over time, that quiet professionalism placed him closer to Elvis than most people ever realized. When the world saw a legend on stage, Strauss saw the man who entered the aircraft afterward, tired, thoughtful, and far more vulnerable than the public ever knew. For decades, Captain Strauss avoided interviews, headlines, and attention. While others rushed to sell stories or exaggerate memories, he remained completely silent. That silence wasn't fear, it was loyalty. He refused to exploit the private moments he witnessed in the air, moments shared only between a pilot, his crew, and the man they carried thousands of miles above the world that worshipped him. The fact that he is speaking now, after all these years, is what makes his account so rare and so powerful. Because Captain Strauss wasn't a fan, a friend seeking fame, or a member of the entourage with something to gain. He was the only person who spent hundreds of hours with Elvis in the one place where the King could finally drop the performance, the quiet, pressurized cabin of his beloved jet. He saw things that no reporter could imagine and no camera could capture. And when he finally chose to break his silence, his words weren't dramatic tabloid claims. They were grounded in calm, first-hand observation. The kind of truth that only someone who was really there could tell. When Elvis Presley customized the Lisa Marie, he wasn't simply creating a luxury aircraft. He was building a sanctuary. Every detail, from the soft leather seating to the gold-plated fixtures, was chosen to carve out a tiny piece of peace in a life that had become overwhelmingly public. In the air, he could finally breathe. The Lisa Marie wasn't just transportation. It was a world suspended above the noise, a place where the King of rock and roll could shed the spotlight and be, for a little while, just a man trying to outrun the weight of fame. Inside this flying mansion, the contrast between opulence and exhaustion was striking. The plane shimmered with elegance. A private bedroom, a conference table shaped for his needs, even seatbelts designed to match the decor. But behind the gleaming surfaces was a deeper purpose: privacy. Elvis controlled every inch of this airborne hideaway because it was the only place where no cameras flashed, no fans pushed forward, and no demands followed him. Up here, he could sleep, think, laugh, or simply sit in silence without anyone expecting a performance. In such a confined and intimate environment, bonds formed differently. Elvis's flight crew, including Captain Ron Strauss, entered a world that few were ever granted access to. They watched him board after long nights and grueling tours, sometimes energized, sometimes drained to the core. Over time, the relationship shifted from employee and boss to something more human. An unspoken understanding built on proximity, trust, and shared hours spent in the quiet hum of the sky. They became witnesses to the private version of Elvis, the version stripped of rhinestones and applause. That intimacy made the contrast all the more haunting. Inside the Lisa Marie's polished halls walked a man whose health, spirit, and energy were dimming, even as the plane around him sparkled with untouched perfection. It was a palace in the clouds carrying a king who was slowly slipping away from the world that adored him. And the crew, bound to him by duty and quiet concern, saw that contrast more clearly than anyone else, especially on one flight that would never leave their memories. By the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley was living inside a body that was slowly betraying him. The world still saw the dazzling jumpsuits, the signature smile, the confident swagger. But behind those bright lights was a man struggling through chronic pain, sleepless nights, and an exhausting cocktail of medications that dulled the spark he once carried effortlessly. Each show demanded more from him than the last, and each tour left him a little more drained. The physical decline was undeniable, but what weighed even heavier was the emotional erosion, the quiet sadness that followed him long after the crowd stopped cheering. While fans only witnessed the glamorous moments, the flight crew saw the truth play out in real time. They watched Elvis climb the stairs to the Lisa Marie with slower steps, sometimes gripping the railing a little tighter than he used to. They noticed the way his shoulders sagged the moment the cabin door closed, as if he were shedding a mask he could no longer keep on. These men weren't doctors or managers. They were silent observers who saw far more than they ever spoke about. And the more time they spent with him in the isolated cocoon of the jet, the clearer it became just how much he was carrying alone. Flights that had once been lively and social gradually grew quieter. Elvis, who used to walk through the cabin chatting or playing cards with his entourage, increasingly retreated to the bedroom or sat in thoughtful silence near a window. Sometimes he would talk about future songs or movie ideas with a flicker of excitement, but just as often he would drift into long spells of reflection, staring out at the endless sky as if searching for answers he couldn't find anywhere on the ground. The crew learned to read his moods by the way he moved, by how quickly he disappeared behind a closed door, or by how intently he watched the world pass beneath him. Yet for all his struggles, the sky remained the one place where Elvis seemed to loosen the invisible grip that held him down. Up there, above the noise and chaos of fame, he looked lighter, as if altitude stripped away expectations and allowed him to exist for a few precious hours without judgment or demands. The Lisa Marie wasn't just an aircraft, it was escape, even if only temporary. And the crew sensed that with every passing month, Elvis relied on that escape more than ever, seeking something in the clouds that he could no longer find in the life waiting for him below. As the months went on, the changes in Elvis became impossible for the crew to ignore. His fatigue deepened in ways that went far beyond simple exhaustion from touring. Some days he boarded the plane moving slowly, almost cautiously, as though every step required deliberate effort. Other times he slipped into long stretches of silence, retreating into himself the moment he crossed the cabin threshold. The Lisa Marie, once filled with laughter and conversation, grew quieter with each passing flight. The crew didn't need to speak about it. They all sensed the same shift, a heaviness that followed Elvis everywhere he went. Scattered across tables or tucked discreetly into bags were prescription bottles the public never saw. Their growing presence painted a troubling picture. Some flights Elvis seemed perfectly coherent, charismatic, sharp, and even playful. But at other times his words trailed off, his movements slowed, and his attention drifted unpredictably. These swings weren't the dramatic, headline-grabbing moments people imagine. They were subtle, unsettling changes that only those in close proximity could detect. And for the men tasked with keeping him safe in the sky, those changes added a layer of quiet concern to every journey. Yet despite the struggles, glimpses of the old Elvis still surfaced. There were flights where he emerged from rest refreshed, smiling warmly as he asked the crew about their families or thanked them for a smooth takeoff. He would crack jokes, share stories, or simply fill the cabin with a spark of the charm that had once electrified the world. These moments were genuine, heartfelt reminders of the kind, thoughtful man beneath the global icon. But just as quickly as they came, they could fade, replaced by a distant stare or a withdrawal so complete it felt like he was somewhere far beyond the cabin walls. Over time, the crew developed a quiet, unspoken understanding. Elvis was battling far more than anyone publicly acknowledged. They never confronted him, never overstepped their roles, but their worry hung in the air on every flight. They saw the contrast more vividly than anyone, the legend adored by millions and the man privately unraveling under the strain of his own life. And even though they didn't know the full scope of what he was facing, they all sensed the same unsettling truth. Something was slipping away, piece by piece, with every passing mile in the sky. 2 days before Elvis Presley's death, the Lisa Marie lifted off the runway under clear skies and calm conditions. Exactly the kind of flight Captain Ron Strauss had made countless times before. But almost immediately, something felt different. It wasn't anything dramatic or chaotic. In fact, it was the absence of those things that made the moment so unsettling. The plane, normally alive with chatter, footsteps, or the soft hum of Elvis's entourage settling in, felt unusually still. It was as if the aircraft itself recognized the shift, the air somehow heavier, quieter, more watchful. From the moment Elvis boarded, that quietness only deepened. He didn't greet anyone with his usual warmth or even offer the faint, weary smile he often gave on tougher days. Instead, he moved with a calm, almost eerie composure, silent, deliberate, and detached from everything around him. Even the way he lowered himself into his seat seemed different, as though he were carrying an invisible weight that pressed down on his shoulders and slowed every gesture. The crew exchanged glances, their instincts alerting them to something they couldn't quite name. Throughout the flight, no one spoke above a whisper, and even that seemed too loud for the energy in the cabin. Conversations that might normally fill the space faded before they began. The Memphis Mafia members on board, usually rowdy or joking to pass the time, stayed unusually subdued. They looked toward Elvis now and then, but no one approached him, not because they didn't care, but because something about his stillness felt sacred, untouchable, like he had wrapped himself in a silence they were afraid to break. Everyone sensed something was off, but no one dared to ask what it was. Elvis spent the entire flight staring through the oval window beside him, never shifting his posture, never adjusting his gaze. He didn't eat, didn't speak, didn't even glance around the cabin. His eyes remained fixed on the sky, locked onto something far beyond the clouds. Strauss would later describe it as a kind of deep, unreachable distance, the look of a man who was physically present but mentally far away. From the cockpit, Strauss could feel the stillness pressing through the door, an unspoken tension that made every routine check feel strangely amplified. He had flown Elvis through storms, turbulence, and long, grueling tours, but he had never felt an atmosphere quite like this. At the time, though, Strauss didn't have the faintest idea what this behavior truly meant. To him, it was an unusual mood on an otherwise ordinary flight. A quiet day for a man who had quiet days from time to time. Elvis's silence didn't come with warning signs or obvious distress. It was just different, unsettling in a way he couldn't explain. And so Strauss focused on his job, guiding the plane smoothly home, unaware that this silent journey would become the last time he ever flew the King. Only later would he look back and realize how much that stillness had been trying to tell him. When Captain Ron Strauss finally broke his silence years later, he chose his words carefully, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. He revealed that during that final flight, he felt something shift in a way he couldn't explain, almost as if a presence, a heaviness, or some invisible part of Elvis had quietly slipped away as they traveled through the sky. Other flights had been emotional, even tense at times, but this one carried a strange, almost spiritual gravity. Strauss wasn't a man prone to dramatics or superstition, yet he admitted that what he felt that day stayed with him long after the engine shut down. As he reflected on the moment, Strauss confessed that it felt eerily like Elvis had been saying his goodbyes without ever speaking a word. Not to the crew specifically, not to anyone in particular, but to the world, to the life that had both lifted him up and crushed him under its weight. There was something about Elvis's distant gaze, the way he stared out the window as if searching the horizon, that made Strauss feel the man wasn't simply lost in thought. It was as though Elvis had crossed into a kind of quiet acceptance, a stillness that hinted at a farewell no one could yet understand. What struck Strauss even more deeply was his growing belief that Elvis himself sensed something was coming. Not a prediction, not a conscious expectation, but an instinct, a heaviness that clung to him on that flight, the way some people can sense a storm long before it breaks. Strauss would later say that Elvis had the look of a man who wasn't preparing for another concert or another tour, but for something far more permanent. It wasn't fear he saw, it was resignation, or perhaps relief, wrapped in silence. In all his years of flying Elvis across the country, through good days and bad, Strauss had never encountered silence like the one inside the cabin that day. He described it as final, a word he didn't use lightly. It wasn't an awkward quiet, nor the weary stillness Elvis sometimes retreated into after a long performance. This was deeper, heavier, and profoundly different. The air felt charged, the kind of quiet that makes a person instinctively lower their voice, as if standing in a place where something sacred is unfolding. To Strauss, the flight felt less like a routine journey home and more like a transition. He later likened it to watching someone walk partway through an open doorway, suspended between two worlds. Elvis was physically there, breathing, sitting, staring out at the sky. But emotionally, spiritually, he felt halfway gone. The man who had filled stadiums with his voice now seemed to be letting go in complete silence, as though drifting somewhere the rest of them couldn't follow. That feeling never left Strauss. Even decades later, when he finally spoke about it, his voice carried the same uneasy reverence. The memory of that quiet figure at the window, the strange peace in the cabin, and the sense of something slipping away haunted him for the rest of his life. To him, that flight wasn't just the last trip Elvis ever took. It was the moment he truly began to leave the world behind. When news broke just 48 hours after that flight that Elvis Presley had died, Captain Ron Strauss felt the world tilt beneath him. At first, he couldn't even process the words. He had just flown Elvis home, watched him walk down the steps of the Lisa Marie under his own power. Shock washed over him in waves, followed by an overwhelming disbelief that someone he'd seen so recently, someone he had come to quietly care for, could be gone so suddenly. It didn't make sense, until memories of that eerily silent flight came rushing back. In the hours that followed, Strauss realized that the strange stillness surrounding Elvis on the plane hadn't been just another quiet mood or moment of exhaustion. It had been something far deeper, something he hadn't understood at the time. The way Elvis sat motionless, the silence that filled the cabin, the unspoken heaviness that clung to the air, all of it took on a haunting new meaning. Strauss found himself replaying every detail, each one now fitting into a pattern he hadn't recognized until it was too late. Grief swept through the crew as the dawning realization set in. They had unknowingly witnessed the final peaceful moments of a man the world believed it knew, but never truly saw. While fans mourned the superstar, the crew mourned the quiet figure who had stared out the Lisa Marie's window, like he was already drifting somewhere beyond their reach. In hindsight, that flight became more than just a routine trip home. It was a moment frozen in time, a farewell wrapped in silence, and a memory that would stay with each of them for the rest of their lives. For years after Elvis's passing, Captain Ron Strauss refused to speak publicly about what he had witnessed. It wasn't out of fear or discomfort. It was loyalty. He had spent countless hours with Elvis in the quiet intimacy of the Lisa Marie, seeing sides of the man that the public never would, and he refused to turn those private moments into headlines. In Strauss's mind, sharing those stories too soon, or with the wrong intent, would have meant exploiting someone who had trusted him implicitly. Silence felt like the only way to honor that trust. To Strauss, the cockpit was a sacred space. It was the one place where the performance stopped, where the pressure disappeared, and where Elvis could be human without judgment. Strauss guarded that space fiercely, long after the world had moved on to dissect every detail of Elvis's final days. He felt a duty not just to the icon the world adored, but to the vulnerable man he had flown across the country. A man who had laughed, rested, reflected, and struggled in the privacy of that aircraft. Protecting Elvis's humanity became a quiet promise he kept for decades. But as the years passed, Strauss watched misinformation, exaggerated claims, and sensationalized stories twist the truth about those final days. People who had barely known Elvis were suddenly experts, while those who had stood closest to him remained silent. Eventually, Strauss realized that withholding his experience no longer protected Elvis. It allowed false narratives to spread unchecked. When he finally chose to speak, he did so not for fame or attention, but out of respect. He wanted the world to understand the truth, not the spectacle, not the myths, but the quiet, human moments that honored the man behind the legend. In the end, when Captain Ron Strauss reflected on his years flying Elvis Presley, he didn't speak about the sold-out arenas, the fame, or the global phenomenon that followed the king everywhere he went. Instead, he spoke about the quiet man who stepped onto his plane, searching for something the world could never give him: peace. Strauss remembered the soft moments between takeoff and landing, The rare times when Elvis seemed to shed the heavy armor of celebrity and simply exist as a man trying to breathe above the noise of his own legend. That, to Strauss, was the real Elvis. Even decades later, the image that lingered most vividly in Strauss's mind was Elvis sitting silently by the Lisa Marie's window on that final flight. The world stretched out beneath him, but his gaze was fixed beyond the clouds, as if looking for something just out of reach. Strauss often returned to that moment, replaying it with the quiet ache of someone who witnessed a truth he only understood in hindsight. That still frame, Elvis motionless, distant, wrapped in a silence that filled the entire cabin, became the memory that defined his time with the king. And while no one on board that day knew what was coming, Strauss carried a belief that grew stronger as the years passed. Elvis found more freedom in the sky than he ever did on the ground. Up there, he wasn't a superstar, an icon, or a headline. He was simply a man finally able to let go. And on that last flight home, Strauss felt that Elvis may have touched the peace he had been chasing his entire life.